So welcome to the lecture. Today's lecture will be on the neurobiology of learning and creativity. So this is a convergence class. We've talked about history. We've talked about business. We've talked about innovation, of course. We talked about evolution, so many topics. And now we're going to talk about neurobiology of learning and creativity. So we finished the first half of the course, which is about the fundamentals in history. We talked about what is innovation, the history of innovation. As I mentioned, we went through a whole tour of many topics and many time periods, talking also about innovation in Korea, innovation in scientific method, and East and West, and so forth. Now we're entering the second part of the course, where we will focus on methods and applications of innovation. In other words, how to innovate. And one of the central core elements of this is the neurobiology of how we learn and how we create. In other words, how does the brain come up with new ideas? And understanding this will provide some, I think, very important insights into the innovation process, both in general and theoretically, but also practically for your own benefit in your future career in innovation. So just by way of review, I have, as you know, sent out the projects via email to everybody. And there are three short projects in addition to the final project, which I'll talk separately. But the three short projects are: number one, about curiosity, to attend a webinar, a research seminar uh, at Digist or outside, preferably outside your area of interest, and to email in response to the email regarding this project your answer, basically one page, about what you found interesting and what you learned. And that is due before class, before 3 p.m. on Friday, December 4th. The second project, as you know, is about observation. So take a walk around and just look at things and see if there's something interesting, strange, or mysterious. And to write a short paragraph or two, one page essentially, about why you found this interesting and what might be some of the implications of this finding, which may seem trivial, may seem small, but could be very big implications for science, for life, or whatever it may be. Because it's an observation, you can share a picture or video as well, again, responding to that email. And the due date is by 3 p.m. on Friday, December 11th. Now, this observation aspect is very interesting because, to be very frank, most people go through life not really looking around at what's in the environment. You know, you have your table, you have your chair, you have your computer, and all these things exist. And you don't look at it and say, oh, why was that designed that way? Or why is that the color this way? And or you look at the natural world, you see the trees and whatever. Why are the trees green in the summer? Why do they turn red in the fall? We don't really ask these questions. We just kind of like zombie, all of us, we just go through life. And of course, that's useful because you can't go through life always looking at everything and saying, oh my God, this is so interesting. You know, we won't be able to eat, sleep, or whatever because we're so fascinated by everything. So you have to be in some ways like a zombie just to get through life. But on the other hand, if you want to be innovative and be creative, you have to have an observational skill. You can't just float through life this way. And therefore, this exercise of observation is extremely important. And then the third one is about passion, to make an innovative suggestion about improving online educational experience at Digis. This is a crisis. This is a big challenge, but all of times in crisis and challenge, that's where innovation happens. And instead of sitting passively and just accepting the situation, to actually think about how to improve it and to make changes. And this is another key aspect of innovation, because if you don't have a passion to improve your life, improve the life around you, improve the life of others, you cannot innovate. Of course, you can innovate and say, okay, I make my parents happy, or I do it because the government wants me to, or my boss wants me to be innovative. I do it because it looks good. Uh, these are all motivations for innovation, but in the end, that's not a sustainable motivation. I think somebody needs to mute. Okay, we have some background noise. Sorry about that. Thank you. So if you're motivated to innovate just because it looks good, or you want to make somebody happy, or that's what someone told you, sometimes you can innovate, but that's not really a sustainable, long-term, effective, efficient way to innovate. And ultimately, to innovate, it means you want to make some change. You want to make something better. And that's a passion. And hopefully this third assignment will help develop this passion, due by the last day of class, Friday, December 18th at 3 p.m. Again, one page. An important thing about this project is it should not just be a new idea, but it should have a specific plan, a simple plan or path to making it real. Because as we know, innovation is not just a new idea, that's creativity, but it is the implementation and realization of that new idea. So this is for discussion, starting out this class. What method or technique do you find especially helpful to learn things? So let's ask Choi Ji-woo. Choi Ji-woo, do you have any special method that you like to use for learning?
Mm, I don't really have any special method, but I prefer reading than watching videos when I learning.
Okay, great. Why is that? What do you find about video that's not so good, or watching?
Because video is too long to get some information what I want to exactly.
Right, so it's kind of stretched out,
Yeah.
whereas reading you can find something specifically.
Yes.
That's interesting. Okay, so people have different learning styles. Thank you very much. Let's go to Chang Juhi. Chang Juhi.
Yes,
What kind of method do you use or for learning?
um, I'm writing the I'm running those after watching video
Hmm.
or studying. Then I am writing the running those uh, accepting looking.
Okay, so you're writing down a summary.
Yeah, writing now. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's go to An Sang Jun. An Sang Jun.
Yes.
Uh, what kind of method do you use to learn things?
Mm, mm, method. Um,
Any special method?
Nothing special.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go to last person, Kong Yong Jae. Kong Yong Jae. Any special method or technique that you use to learn
Yes.
things?
I use Googling.
Oh, you Googling. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Uh, how about how do you remember things? I mean, if you Google, you don't have to remember, right? So, what's your technique for learning? In other words, to remember what you learned.
Um, I write to writing to
Writing.
remember.
You
Yes.
write it down to remember. Okay. Okay, very good. So some of you answered about writing down in order to remember. Some of you talked about reading instead of video and so forth. So one of the purposes of today's class, actually, we'll be talking about what I think is the most powerful method to learn things. And it's not just me that mentions this, but I read separately that Elon Musk uses this kind of a method, and we will explain that later in the class. So we'll quickly do a review from the previous class, which was about innovation and culture, where we talked about the great divergence between East and West and what cultural factors may or may not be involved. We talked about Silicon Valley uh, and what are the features of that. And we also talked about Startup Nation and the example of Israel. We had a special lecture on the chaebols in Korea and why they formed in order to improve the networking and the ecosystem development, which is also related to innovation. We won't review that topic. We won't review that special lecture, but that's also a cultural factor. So the Great Divergence, as mentioned, was in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, the divergence between very significant Asian economies like India and China and the Western economies, and basically in Europe, and lagging somewhat was Japan. So this is the great divergence of GDP, or gross domestic product, over time. And of course, India and China catching up, and that divergence is not as marked. But this raised many questions. What was it about uh, the development and the wealth development and the modernization that took off more in the Western world than the Eastern world? Again, there are some exceptions, but this was a very important question, not only for this historical issue, but it pertains to individuals innovating, societies innovating, and of course, companies innovating. So in summary, they looking at a lot of factors. One of them is the physical environment, that Europe was fairly stable, although I don't know if that's exactly right. You had many wars, obviously, and so forth, the Napoleonic Wars. So I don't know if stability was necessarily an advantage for Europe. One clear advantage was a very extensive access to the sea, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Atlantic, of course, and that created a lot of contact with other cultures and other ideas, very important, as we talked about, for innovation. There has been some talk about culture and religion, and that Asia favored obedience and not really trying to create new things necessarily. That may not entirely be correct, because we also had obedience issues, if you will, in the West. And there's a famous example of Galileo, and he was forced to recant his views on astronomy and so forth by virtue of the Catholic Church. Granted, that was before the Industrial Revolution, but we also had obedience issues in the West as well, if you will. And then political and social institutions, with Asia being more authoritative and authoritarian, excuse me, and Europe having rule of law and property rights, and that's very important for development of companies and innovation, and so people can benefit from the innovation and not get their innovation stolen and so forth. So I think these are very important factors. Markets were well developed in both Asia and Europe, and technology. Asia had originally developed a lot of the technologies we talked about, fire, gunpowder, we talked about printing and so forth, which were developed in Asia, but they didn't maintain those advantages. Then we talked about Silicon Valley and its diversity of companies and diversity of industries. So it's not just a industry specific sector. We gave the example of Pangyo focusing on games, but Silicon Valley is actually many different technologies, many different industries, from social media to biotechnology to software to manufacturing. And then also very important, which we talked about in the Chaebol seminar, is the supporting infrastructure so that even areas that are not related to innovation, such as professional services and manufacturing and so forth, can support the innovation ecosystem. And all of this is evident in Silicon Valley. And also this diversity was not just over space, but over time. And so we saw waves of innovation centered around integrated circuits. That's where the name Silicon Valley comes from. But waves of different innovation from vacuum tubes in the 1920s to social media and now AI in the current era. And of course, Silicon Valley focusing on disruption and having all these ecosystem elements that we discussed, from mentors to angels to venture capital, very well developed peer networks. So very human element of different people interacting and getting ideas and exchanging ideas, to the mundane things, maybe boring, but accounting, legal, intellectual property, information technology, infrastructure and support, banking, and many corporate clients, and of course the academia, Stanford University, and so forth. So very complex ecosystem. So the ecosystem aspect of innovation is extremely important. And then we saw a similar dynamic in Israel, and many reasons, but the reasons are not one reason, but really, in a sense, the whole complex of reasons that come together, again, summarized by this ecosystem concept. So that's a brief review of last week. Now let's move to today's lecture, where we'll talk about the neurobiology of creativity and learning. We'll give some background. We'll talk about the neurobiology of learning specifically, and we'll talk about the mind and creativity. So let's start out with a question, because we're talking about learning. What exactly is learning? Uh, let's start with Kim Hyo-jin. Kim Hyo-jin, what is learning? Kim Hyo-jin. Let's go to Chan Ji-yoon. Chan Ji-yoon, what is learning? What would you define as learning? All of you are students. We're an academic institution. Our job is to learn. What is learning? Any thoughts? Chan Ji-yoon.
Yes, I think it's being used to something,
Being used to what?
something like something experiment or skills or any other things.
So experiment or skills. Okay, let's go, thank you. Let's go to Kim Min-ung. Kim Min-ung.
Yes,
What is learning?
uh, I think learning is the way to know what
The
I
way to
didn't
know.
know.
Say that again.
The way to know what I didn't know before.
Okay, that's a good way. Way to know what I didn't know before. Something new, obviously. So that's actually a very interesting point, because you might ask, we're an innovation class. Why are we learning about learning? But learning, of course, is related to newness. which of course is related to innovation. So there is, as we're developing in today's lecture, a very important connection. Let's go to Om Se-jong. Om Se-jong. What
Yes.
is learning?
Mm, mm, I have no idea.
You have no idea. Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. That's a very good answer. And I'll tell you why that's a good answer. Remember, I said at the beginning about the projects, observation, curiosity, passion, in particular the observation. And I talked about us just going through life and not really observing and thinking about what's around us. This is an example. Of course, everybody knows what the word learning means, but do you really think about what it is? Because think about it, we are here in a university, we are students, we are all, our primary job, our main goal. In the French say raison d'être. Raison d'être means the reason to be is to learn. But we never really ask what is learning. What actually happens when we learn? Now, as you know, this class is about integrating science and art. And sometimes art gives us a better sense of what the truth is than necessarily sort of reality, not reality, but necessarily science. I'm not saying science is not true. We talked about this in previous lecture, but at the same rate, in artistic expression, it can be very informative. So here's a painting, one of my favorite paintings. And this painting is by the Swiss artist Paul Klee. And the title of this painting is One Who Understands. And this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And when I was in medical school, I would do a lot of studying in the museum. And so I actually would go to the museum, not all the time, but many times, and take my books and I would go to the galleries and I would study in the museum. And part of it was to just have a different sort of environment, to get the inspiration from the art, to think about things, and I could make connections with the art. And I came across this painting and I really liked it. So obviously it's a face and someone is looking, and this is somebody who understands. Anybody want to uh, say what they think when they see this painting? Why is this painting about understanding? One of the students answered that learning is like to know something that you didn't know, is a kind of understanding. So let's go to Che Chok or Chok Che Chok.
Yes.
When you look at this painting and the title is One Who Understands, what are your thoughts? Does this kind of express this concept about somebody who understands or has just learned something?
I think it's somebody's sight about this person because uh, the lines are very diverse
Yes.
and uh, uh, it's including some sketch including just eye and some is excluding mouth and it's like the very different ways to see one person.
Yes. That sounds good. Thank you. Let's go to one more person. Lee Ho Jun. Lee Ho Jun. What do you
yes.
think of this painting? This, in terms of this title,
Mm,
One Who Understands.
uh, 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 I think this painting says person can understand the new something new in variable ways.
So there's a variability, a difference to it.
Yes.
Okay, so these are good. Thank you for answering. Let me give you some of my thoughts. So I split this into the form. I split my kind of impression of the painting into the form and into the emotion. So first, let's go with the form. So as you can see, there are circles, lines, and points. And many of you in with a background in mathematics know, circles are different. They have a curvature. Lines are different. Of course, circles are curved lines, and then there's points, one dimension, two dimensions, and so forth. The concept here is that there are many different uh, elements that are quite different, as you implied, and also the straight lines are at different angles and so forth, but they come together in a way that you can recognize this is a person. So very confusing, separate depictions, very, I should say, very confusing or separate structures, circles, lines, points, come together, and you're like, that's very recognizable. I even can feel a kind of personality, even just from these elements. We'll talk about the personality in the second part. So that's one thing that I feel when I see the painting. So understanding is to take very diverse components and come together in a coherent way. The other aspect is this fuzziness in the background, the solid, not the lines, but the solid in the background. And there's an element of this dissipation where the fuzziness is solid here, or I shouldn't say fuzziness, the solidness, and you have this light, much lighter outside, and understanding is trying to get to that light. But what's interesting about this, as I see it, that the darkness, which is sort of maybe the less understanding, separated from the lightness, is separated by a space which is fuzzy, which is even brighter. And what this impression gives to me is that at the point of understanding, where you things are clearing up, it's actually even brighter. Your feeling is even brighter than once you've fully established the understanding. So in that transition, and I know all of you have experienced this in learning something, it's very confusing. And then suddenly you feel like you understand. That is a very bright feeling. And that's what I think is depicted here. Let's go to the second part, the emotion. The emotion is a little bit strange because it's neutral. So there's a mouth here, and it's not really smiling. It's not really angry. It's not really sad. It's neutral. And one can understand something good, so they're happy, or they can understand something very bad, which is, of course, not happy or angry. They can understand something, bad about somebody else or about their situation or whatever. So the emotional content of understanding is, in a way, neutral. But what's interesting about this smile, it's like a Mona Lisa smile. It looks neutral, but it's neither happy nor sad, but it has a feeling of being satisfied. So when you understand something, even something bad, you have a more comfortable feeling. If you understand that your friend became a bad person or did something bad to you, you understand, and you, of course, that's a bad thing, but at least the confusion was cleared and there's an element of a satisfied feeling. So this is a neutral smile, I would call it. So that's my interpretation of this, of the experience of learning. So now let's go to the neurobiology. So as you know, many of you, of course, have backgrounds in biology. Neurons or nerve cells are the key elements of the nervous system. There are two types of neural cells. There are neurons and glial cells. So neurons are the basic unit of structure and function for neural tissues. Their most notable quality is irritability. Irritability sounds a little bit strange, but it's the ability to produce action potentials, which we'll talk about, which are the electrical response of those cells in response to an external stimulus or from stimulus from another cell. And then the second type of cell are the glial cells, and these generally serve supporting functions, such as immune function, repair, nutrition, and so forth. Those are the glial cells. So neurons and glial cells. So let's look at the basic neuron. The basic neuron has two parts: the cell body, which we also call the soma, and around the cell body are these small appendages called dendrites. And the second part is the axon, which is a long extension of the cell, which the action potential goes down. Now, corresponding to these two anatomical parts of the neuron are two types of electrical activity. And they are local potentials, which are small electrical changes in the membrane, and action potentials, which are large changes in the membrane. So impulses or signals arrive to soma and the dendrites with the local potential. And at some point, there is a threshold, which we'll talk about, and an action potential is created. This axon has what's called myelination around it, which speeds up the axon transmission. That myelination is generated by these glial cells, as we can see. So electrical activity is critical to the function of these neurons. And the signals that we talk about, either the small local potentials or the large action potentials, take place with a background over what's called the resting potential. And the resting potential is a result of high potassium inside and high sodium outside. And this potassium inside is going out of the cell membrane and generating a negative excess of charges or excess of negative charges on the inside of the membrane. And so in the resting state, these cell membranes are permeable to the potassium, which means the resting potential is dominated by this equilibrium of potassium, means that you have about minus 70 or minus 75 millivolts of the resting potential. So that's the, by resting, we mean that's the way the cell is. And for that matter, it's not just neurons, but almost all cells have this electrical imbalance, if you will. It's a balance, but electrical separation of charge, resulting in the inside being negative. So what is the action potential then? So here's the resting potential as we described. If the potassium conductance is determining that potassium is going outside the cell from the inside and therefore leaving a buildup of negative charges on the inside. What if you switch the cell's permeability from potassium to sodium? Then you'll have sodium going inside and positive charges building up on the inside. And so that's what results in this action potential. It's essentially a shift between potassium and sodium. So we have a local potential and an action potential, and the threshold between them generates, if the local potential is big enough, it will then generate a action potential above that threshold. So this is what it looks like in action, if you will. It goes from minus 70 to plus 35, plus 45, depends, some cells different, and then returns to the resting potential. You could see at the threshold point, you get this sudden action potential. So local potential gives rise to action potential. So why are we talking about all this? Well, of course, in the brain, there are billions, if not trillions, of neurons, and these different cells will communicate with each other via what's called a synapse. So information is transmitted from one cell to another cell, another neuron, or another muscle cell via the synapse. What is this synapse? The synapse is essentially a connection, and by connection, there is actually a space between a presynaptic neuron, which we see on the left, and a postsynaptic neuron on the right. And on the presynaptic neuron, we have a action potential, and the results on the postsynaptic cell are one of either three results. Actually, it could be a combination of them. It could be a local potential, and that local potential can be excitatory, more positive, or inhibitory, more negative. That's number one. The result could also be a direct action potential. That's number two. Or the result could be biochemical changes in the cell, in the postsynaptic side. And these biochemical changes in the cell is what accounts for learning. Learning is the ability to adapt and make a model of reality around, remember that, and change your behavior as a result of that adaptation. So how is that adaptation reflected in the body? It's reflected in these biochemical cellular changes of the neurons as they are interacting with the signals, which reflect ultimately from the environment. So changes in the cells are the underlying mechanism of learning. We're going to develop this in more detail. Now, there are two types of synapses. There are electrical synapses, which are direct connection where the ions flow directly. And so you have an action potential leading to an action potential. And there are chemical synapses. And the chemical synapses basically involve an action potential coming, release of a neurotransmitter. It's a molecule that goes from the presynaptic side to the postsynaptic side. Number three is binding of this transmitter to the receptor. And number four is the various actions, which we discussed. And so this is an animation of that process, the presynaptic cell, the synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic cell. And you can see that here we have the action potential, transmitter released, binding to the receptor, and then another potential change in the postsynaptic cell. So these connections and how they get stronger or don't get stronger are ultimately the neurochemical, neurobiological basis of learning. So let's look at this in a little more detail. What is synaptic learning? So this is the synapse with, as we described, the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell. And you can see here, this is a conceptualization, simplification, two receptors before learning. After learning, this is a stronger connection as manifested by the four receptors in this case. So there are other mechanisms in which this strengthening occurs, but one of them is the number of receptors as one example. So how do we know this? Well, there are experiments that have been done with what are called long-term potentiation. Potentiation means make it more efficient, make the synapse more effective, which is what we talked about in terms of receptor number and so forth. And long-term means that the effectiveness lasts for a long time, days, weeks, even months, and so forth. And these experiments were done by Eric Kandel and other colleagues at Columbia University, and he was actually my neurobiology teacher. And what they did is they have a presynaptic neuron and they would do stimulation. And that stimulation would make that synapse fire or activate, and then they would do recordings. And they found that if they did a lot of stimulations, the recording afterward would improve. That would be called potentiation. So what do we mean by improve? Before the long-term potentiation, LTP, you get this signal. EPSP is excitatory postsynaptic potential. So excitatory means making it positive. So you get this relatively small local potential. And then after inducing long-term potentiation, you have a very high or large potential, which of course, because it's larger, it has more chance of activating the threshold, so more chance of creating an action potential. So that's long-term potentiation. They did more studies, what happens to these cells. And again, Eric Kandel and his colleagues got the Nobel Prize in 2000 for this. Another interesting connection with the neurobiology of learning is we talked about synaptic strength. So we talked about the chemistry and so forth, specifics. But if we look more generally at the relationship of sleep and learning, so when you're awake, you're starting to do this synaptic potentiation as we described, which is related to learning. So you have, as you go to sleep, a high synaptic density. And actually, by sleeping, many of those synapses will then go back to their previous unstrengthened or unpotentiated state. In other words, you are essentially during sleep forgetting. Now you might say, well, if I want to learn, I'll never go to sleep. That's not the answer. In fact, the sleep is extremely important for learning. So remember we talked about Michelangelo and his David statue and sculpture and so forth. And there are two ways you can make a sculpture. One is additive, which is the basis of 3D printing. So you add things, add material. The other one is subtractive, where you chip away at the marble and create the sculpture. Of course, Michelangelo did not have 3D printers. He did subtractive manufacturing. He pulled away things. And a lot of beauty, a lot of art, a lot of incredible sculpture is made by subtractive approaches. And so if you want to learn something, you also want to remember what's important. And the brain is not just adding more and more knowledge, but also modifying and taking away knowledge in order to optimize this learning, optimize what you have experienced for the environment, so you adapt and internalize this environment. So during the sleep, you consolidate the memories, homeostasis of synapses. Some of them get stronger, some of them get weaker. And so you have your brain kind of being like a sculpture. It gets more beautiful and more well-developed. It learns more by the next day. So sleep and learning are very important. So now let's shift gears to the immune system. So the title of this lecture is Neurobiology, but now we're going to talk about the immune system. But the immune system, if you think about it, is a kind of nervous system. It has to sense the outside world. So in this case, viruses, such as COVID, bacteria, and it has to remember those invaders, those microbes, because immunity is basically you get infected the first time and you want to react to it more effectively the second time. In other words, your body, your immune system has learned. So there are close relationship between the immune system and the neurobiological system. So there are two parts to the immune system. There's the central immune system, which is the T cells are thymus and the B cells are bone marrow. B cells produce antibodies, which we'll talk about, but we don't need to know these details for now. And there are the peripheral immune organs or tissues, like the lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils, the tissues around the organs and under the skin and so forth. So these two types, central and peripheral, undergo different types of growth and development. Think about the synapses, think about the neurons. In the central tissues, they grow antigen independently. In other words, all of them grow. So you get all these stem cell derived immune cells. And in the peripheral tissues, they will then grow in an antigen dependent fashion. In other words, only those immune cells that have been exposed to a certain antigen or certain virus or a certain bacteria, antigen is a general term for these things, will then grow. And what that means is the immune system is like a brain, it is going to reflect the outside reality. Those who have been exposed to COVID will have antigen dependent growth of cells that produce antibodies to COVID. And so that immune system has a memory, if you will, for that infection. So adaptation takes place in this antigen dependent fashion. So we have what's called the primary and secondary immune response. So you see here, this is the ACE2 target of the spike protein on COVID. And the spike protein binds to the ACE2, and that's how the lung cells get infected and so forth. And of course, an antibody, neutralizing antibody, can block that connection and prevent the virus from infecting the cell. So that neutralizing antibody depicted here, if you have a initial challenge with the virus, will have a small response. We call that the primary response. But if you have a primary response and the second time you challenge with the virus, the antibodies are much greater, and we call that a secondary response. And that we'd call, of course, immunity. So the immune system has learned. So we've talked about neurobiology of learning, we've talked about the immune system and learning, and it is a way of changing in response to the outside environment, so your behavior in response to the outside environment is more optimum. So when you learn for an exam, you have to change yourself so that next time you get the test on the exam, you give a better answer. You have adapted to that situation. That's learning. So we have different types of methods of learning. There are passive methods, rereading, highlighting, cramming, especially all night. As we mentioned, there's a close connection between sleeping and learning. So these passive methods don't typically work. And then we have active methods of learning, and these are better for remembering for the long term. Think long-term potentiation. So some of you said writing, making a diagram, drawing. And this adaptive learning is related to increased mastery. So I will conclude by talking about my theory of learning. And actually, just a few weeks ago, I saw that it's similar to Elon Musk's theory of learning. So first, let me explain how I've framed learning. So this is a graph with two lines. One line is linear, so it's a linear learning, where it grows as a function of n, and the other line is curved, which is logarithmic learning, so logarithm of n. And Elon Musk actually calls it exponential learning. What are these lines relating to? On the vertical axis is the what I call the number of brain cells used. I put that in quotes because it's not really a real number. You can think of it as number of memory cells, number of synapses, whatever it may be. It's a function of how much resources are devoted to learning and internalizing that knowledge, that new knowledge. On the horizontal axis is the amount of knowledge learned. So number of pages memorized, number of equations learned, number of concepts that you understand, and so on and so forth. So these two lines reflect the different investment of brain cells or synapses. So how much of your brain do you need to use to create more or to keep and learn more knowledge? So let me ask a question. Which one of these methods, and I'll explain what I mean by these methods, forget the method, which one of these lines, which represent the relationship between amount of knowledge learned to number of brain cells used, is better? I know that's a very vague question, but I just want to be thinking about this. So let's go to uh, uh, Chang Sing He. Chang Sing He.
Yes.
Which of these is better?
Uh, these two graphs.
Yeah, so the red line, the logarithmic graph, or the linear graph, which is better? Like if you wanted to use your brain to learn, and of course, nobody has an infinite brain, right?
Yes.
Which line would be better? Which is more efficient? Which is easier? Which is better?
I think logarithmic graph is better because.
Which one? Logarithmic. Why?
Too fast is because we cannot understand all about things that we learn.
Mm-hmm.
So learning slow is better.
Okay, so this is very interesting that you mentioned learning slow. There is no time element to this graph. The horizontal axis is not time, but amount of knowledge learned. And the vertical axis is number of brain cells used. And it's, so let me explain this in a little more detail. So I'm glad you answered. Thank you very much for that. Let's go to the beginning, early on. The amount of knowledge learned is very small. And actually, the red line is not as good, because in order to learn small amount of knowledge from the beginning, from starting at zero, essentially, you have to use more brain cells. But after you learn a lot of knowledge, the red line is much better. In other words, you have to use less brain cells to learn huge amount of information. Whereas in the linear case, you just have to, if you learn double the information, you have to have double the cells, double the memory chips, and so forth. In this situation, you actually don't have to, you learn double the information, you don't have to do double the neurons, you do less than double. So this was a little bit of a trick question. In the beginning, the logarithmic is more inefficient, but when you have a lot of knowledge, the logarithmic approach is much more efficient. So then you may say, well, what is the actual method? How does this work? Well, the linear method adds information step by step linearly, unconnected to the previous information. So if you learn Newton's equations and you learn Mendel's equations and you learn Maxwell's equations, they're all separate equations. You just memorize them separately. But imagine if you could learn Maxwell's equations and have them related to Newton's equations, and even Mendel's equations related, even though Mendel is genetics and Newton is physics, they have similar concepts. Some of them are linear equations, quadratic equations, and so forth, right? So there's some common concepts to these. That's one reason why we learn mathematics. So the point is that in the linear learning, you just add knowledge incrementally without relating the knowledge to previous knowledge. In the logarithmic learning, when you add a new knowledge, you connect it to the previous knowledge. So for example, Newton developed his first law and he connected to Galileo's law of inertia. He didn't just create it totally separately. He connected the new knowledge to the existing knowledge. Now, the problem with that is you have to create a framework, you have to create a structure for that knowledge in order to add more pieces to it. So the disadvantage of logarithmic learning is that in the beginning, it takes more effort. It's more difficult to create that framework. But then once you create that framework, it is much easier to add new knowledge by connecting it to the previous knowledge. So when you study Newton's laws and Mendel's laws, they're totally different fields, but if you can see some similarities in their structure of the equation, how the experiments were designed, in terms of inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, whatever, these sorts of common themes, some people call that consilience, you will achieve logarithmic learning. So actually the question, which is better, which is not, in my view, the logarithmic is better, but actually early on, it's much more difficult. And that's a real challenge because if you just memorize things separately and add them, you will learn a lot much more quickly, but in the long run, you will never achieve the mastery. You'll never really learn as much as the great masters because they've created these frameworks and they've done logarithmic learning. So as I mentioned just a few weeks ago, I read about this article. So in the PDF, you can click on this. It's from the Entrepreneur's Handbook, the full article, and Elon Musk's 2 rules for learning anything faster. I think the article should be better instead of faster because actually, as I mentioned in the beginning, it takes more time. So rule number 1, make sure you're building a tree of knowledge. So you're always having a structure that you can add new knowledge to. You don't just memorize something, but you try to say, how does this relate to other types of knowledge, and how can I create a structure? So he's, quote, one bit of advice: it is important to view knowledge as a sort of semantic tree. Make sure you understand the fundamental principles, the trunk and the big branches before you get into the leaves and details, or there's nothing for them to hang onto. So make sure you're building a tree of knowledge. And the rule number 2, connections power your learning. He says his second rule of learning, which underlies his ability to build lots of knowledge, is to connect new knowledge to that tree that you established before. And that results in exponential growth. So like any new system, it might take a bit to get the hang of it. So he's actually referring to this sort of difficulty in the beginning. You might actually feel like you're learning slower than you did previously. That's okay. What you're actually doing is building the foundation for exponential growth later on. So that, when I read that article, I thought that was fascinating because I've developed this logarithmic theory for a long time now. I've been teaching it and so forth. And of course, I use it myself. He describes it as exponential, and this is logarithmic. It's the same concept. Build a structure first, and then every time you learn something new, connect it to the previous. So now you can see why you need less brain cells to learn more information, because you're actually just reinforcing, just like the synapse, you're making stronger your original knowledge and just adding a little bit extra. Even though you're adding a whole new idea, you're adding it in relation to the previous knowledge. So then you enter into the realm of logarithmic growth of the brain cells, or exponential growth of the knowledge learned. So why is this important? This is important because Steve Jobs famously said, creativity is just connecting things. But as we just said, learning, really powerful learning, is about making those connections. And so if you learn this way, if you learn by connecting things, you will also have the benefit of having a mindset to connect things for the purpose of creativity and innovation. In other words, if you learn things linearly, you may learn a lot, you may pass your exams, you memorize a lot, and so forth, but you probably will not be innovative. But if you learn things through a process of connecting and actually almost later on being lazy because you don't have to use as many brain cells, you're connecting to your knowledge base before, you will be innovative. And that is the central message of this lecture and why we talk about learning, because it's related to innovation in this way. Not all learning, but this type of connected learning. So we covered the neurobiology of creativity and learning, also a little bit about the immune system, of course, but that's related to neurobiology. And then next week, continuing on methods of innovation, we'll discuss innovation in academia, in universities, and in business, in the corporate research labs. And one major focus of this next lecture will be the open innovation concept, which we referred to in the first lecture, as well as some of the historical examples of open innovation. And we will develop this in more detail. So that's the end of the lecture. Any questions, comments?